Good day, my children, and welcome to our video that covers the content of the Scramble for Africa. Now, the Scramble for Africa, what was the Scramble for Africa, right? So in this sense, in this particular topic, we are going to be looking at how European countries during the 19th century quickly rushed into taking a piece of Africa as a colony for themselves, for their own benefit. This means that they wanted the raw materials, they wanted the minerals that Africa had so that they could acquire wealth and benefit from Africa as a continent. Now, briefly, this is the map of Africa before it was colonized. One thing that you should take note of is that Africa was borderless. There was no particular country in which Africans could not go to because the borders were not as yet set, right? And this here, unfortunately, this map is a bit unclear, but as we can see and as we know already that Africa now has borders, you can see that there is the South African border, Botswana border, Mozambique, Angola, and so forth, right? Now, this is the map of Africa today, post-colonization, right? Post-Scramble for Africa. Now, we are looking at the topic of European colonization of Africa in the late 19th century. Now, what we should establish from this is that until the 1880s, people in Africa ruled themselves, right? By 1900, Europeans had taken over most of Africa as a continent. In the space of 20 years, Africa was then divided into colonies and the lives of African people had changed drastically. Now, why do we then call this the Scramble for Africa? We call this the Scramble for Africa because it happened so quickly that everyone is scrambling and rushing to take a piece of Africa. Now, when you speak of colonies, then we are speaking of countries that are ruled by a foreign power. Moving on to this, we are then looking at Africa before European colonization, right? This is pre-colonization as we would call it. Now, before colonization took place, African people lived in small communities that were based on family connections and clans, right? And there were some large African kingdoms that were developed and they were ruled by a king. Africa, for all intents and purposes, also had its own economic systems, cultures, and carried out trade throughout Africa. Sorry for that. Now, in this sense, the first main contact with Europeans was through the Atlantic slave trade. That's the first part. By 1800, trade and Europe had grown and some European countries had set up trading settlement on the coast of or along major rivers. Now, in this particular slide, we're looking at the Atlantic slave trade route, right? That most of the slaves were shipped from Africa, right, to the Americas, as we'd call it, right? Countries like Senegal, Angola, Congo provided slaves. And then in this sense, we should also take note that millions of slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas, right? And next on, we are then looking at the reason for the race to claim territory in Africa or on the dark continent. Now, these are some of the resources that Africa is rich in, right? Diamonds, gold, coffee, grains, diamonds, crude oil, uranium, and so forth, right? These are the minerals, these are the resources that South Africa or even Africa at large had in abundance. Now, when I say in abundance, I mean in large quantities. And therefore, these minerals are the cause or were the reason why European countries saw the need to quickly rush and claim territory in the dark continent, as they referred Africa to, right? They referred to Africa as the dark continent because they believed that the practices that Africa had, the people were practicing cultures that were considered taboo or dark and unholy. Therefore, that is why it was referred to as the dark continent. Now, it is important then for us to establish, where did this all take place? How did they decide which country would belong to which European country, right? Now, this is where we start speaking about what we refer to as the Berlin Conference, right? The Berlin Conference of 1884. Now, by the 1880s again, there was trading that was growing between Europe and Africa. Now, there was also a lot of tension, however, between countries such as Britain, France, Germany, and other European countries to control this trade between Europe and Africa. Now, in this sense, some parts of Africa, right? In some parts of Africa, European countries then started to build railway links, right, or railway lines to link trading posts to inland areas of Africa. There was also a signing of treaties with African chiefs to gain control over this trade. Therefore, other countries started to send troops to Africa to protect their trading interests and posts. Now, this then led to starting of the takeover process, right, where they were starting to take over some areas of land in Africa. And then this then started that tension where some European leaders then began to think that competition over Africa would lead to a war between them as European countries, right? And this was something that a man, right, wanted to prevent. This man was Bismarck. Now, to prevent war or conflict between European countries, Bismarck, who was the leader of Germany during this time, invited all European countries, right, that had an interest to getting a piece of Africa to a conference in Berlin in 1884. Hence, we call it the Berlin Conference of 1884. Now, what was the aim of this conference? They had the aim to discuss ways of dividing Africa without any war between them, right? They wanted peace and they wanted Africa to be divided fairly and equally amongst them as European countries, right? Now, in this sense, this particular slide here looks at the Berlin Conference, right? As you can see, there are members or men sitting around a table, right? If you look at the middle image, right? And there is Africa written in French, Afrique, as I'll pronounce it. And as you can see, there is a man there who is sort of distributing the cake that is written Africa, right? In this sense, we can then analyze this source and we can then assume that that person there represents Bismarck, the leader of Germany, because he was the one who called upon the Berlin Conference. And if you can look at the image on the left, the first one, now you can see that there are different men that are pulling towards different directions. In the middle, there is Africa there. This also signifies or depicts to us the way in which people of European descent or the European countries wanted a piece of Africa, right? And then on the far right, the last image, you can see that Africa is still at the middle. However, there are depictions of the Grim Reaper, right? This Grim Reaper brings things such as hunger, poverty, disease, famine, and drought to Africa as a continent. Now, one can also analyze this source and say that this is a representation of European countries that wanted to grab Africa. However, in that sense, they also brought about suffering and pain to Africa as a continent. Now, moving on then, we are speaking about this Berlin Conference in detail. Now, what you should also know is that representatives from 15 countries attended the Berlin Conference. However, not even one African leader was invited to attend this conference. Now, the examples of European control that was decided at the conference were the following. The first one was that Congo was given to King Leopold of Belgium. Therefore, Congo was a Belgium colony. Niger River open to trade for all European countries. Now, this speaks to how the Niger River was then considered the open platform where all European countries could trade. East Africa was then given to Germany. Therefore, by granting this, it opened the way for other European powers to think that they had the right to expand their interests in Africa. However, this ironically led to competition to take over parts of Africa, ultimately leading to this scramble for Africa, right? Because it was now a competition. Who is going to get Africa? Who is going to get the bigger piece of the cake of Africa? Now, the results of the Berlin Conference were then as follows. European countries competed to grab parts of Africa quickly, right? The quicker you were, the better you were, and the more land you had to acquire in Africa. By 1913, the whole of Africa was divided up into colonies. However, and sadly, the rights of African people were ignored during this process because remember, not even one African leader was invited to attend. Therefore, African people were oblivious to whatever was happening. They were unaware that there are people that are actually competing to grab onto their continent. Now, this is the map of Africa after the Berlin Conference, right? Now, this map depicts to us or shows us which country of Europe grabbed which part of Africa. As you can see, South Africa was a British colony, including Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And then you can see that Britain had the upper hand in this, meaning that it was quicker because it had most parts of Africa. Then, as you can see, there were parts where some would belong to the Spanish, Italian, and the French and the Portuguese. However, there are two countries, right, that were free. And this is one of the things that we need to speak of. Why were these two countries free and untainted during the Scramble for Africa? One of the things that we had covered in class is that these countries, right, had unity. The people that were staying there had unity amongst themselves, and they did not allow any external influence to break them apart, but they kept their bond, and they decided that they would fight by all means, by all their might, to protect their freedom, to protect their independence, to protect their land, and to protect their minerals and resources. Now, it is also important, what were the causes of colonization as what can you say, colonization in its sense, right? Now, the first part, right, this looks at the reasons why European countries obviously wanted to colonize Africa, right? And these causes were linked to the Industrial Revolution. First of all, Africa was a place where Europe could sell products. Secondly, Africa was a place where Europe could get raw materials. Now, when you speak of raw materials, we are speaking of materials such as water, wood, you understand? All those materials that are not minerals, but just something that you find in nature. Land is included there because it is a raw material, right? And then we look at the third reason, right? That Africa was a place where Europe could get mineral wealth. Now, this is when we come to the concept of the finding of gold, the finding of diamonds, and the lust and the greed of these European countries to acquire these minerals and to acquire mineral wealth, right? And obviously, because of the aforementioned three things, we then discover that investors could also make money in Africa because Africa was, in a sense, a gold mine, right? A diamond mine, a mineral mine, a raw materials mine, and so forth, right? Therefore, this also meant that Africa could provide food and space for European countries. Now, when we speak of colonies, we speak of Africa as divided into different countries and so forth, right? and as seen as colonies, right? Now, the colonies, which are the countries in Africa, could provide food and space for European traders and so forth. Now, why then did European powers succeed in this, right? Now, why European powers were able to colonize Africa so quickly? That is the question. The first part is that there was better transport that they had invented, right, which made colonization possible. Secondly, it is without argument that they had better weapons, right? Gunpowder, guns, cannons, and so forth. Thirdly, is that there was division in Africa, right? And in African societies. People were not united because remember, when we go back and we're looking at the Atlantic slave trade, we realize that it did not just happen, but people in Africa, some African leaders also played a role because they were the ones that were at the forefront of selling their people for enslavement. Now, what was the result of colonization, right? What did it lead to? The first one is that we are looking at the political results, right? How colonies were ruled by European governments. Now, the first part to cover is that European governments sent officials and soldiers to rule their colonies. It was not people within Africa and Africans that ruled these colonies. However, they were put in certain leadership positions, but as puppet leaders in a sense. They always needed to report to the mother country or the ruler of the mother country. When we speak of the mother country, we speak of what? We speak of the colonizing country, right? And then secondly, Africans no longer had the freedom to rule themselves, right? That independence that African people had within themselves, or they could decide how they wanted to operate, was no longer there. Because now there was a new chief in town, right? There was a new leader, right? Therefore, it was not upon them to decide what they wanted to do. In this sense, Europeans divided Africa up by making borders between the different colonies. Hence, you find that now we have different borders that divide different countries, and you cannot go to another African country without a passport and so forth. Now, this is the legacy of European colonization. The final part is that the colonial governments passed laws to keep Africans in an inferior position, right? Now, in this sense, this means that they passed laws that could tell African people that you are less than European people. Therefore, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, you cannot eat this, you cannot go there, you cannot drive this, and so forth, right? Now, these laws aimed toward to grind down on African people, to tell them that you are nothing as compared to European people. Now, in this sense, Africans ended up living a life of segregation and were often treated very badly. And very badly means that it was brutal because it also led to issues of genocide, of mass killings of African people through the hands of colonizers. Now then, we then need to look at the economic results, right? And as discussed in class, you know where to find the economic results. We spoke about this. However, we should also look at the fact that now Africa was a certain trading post, right? Wealth was generated for African, not for African, but for European countries through Africa. Jewelry was what? Was formed in Europe and then transported to Africa or resold at an inflated price to African people, right? The third one, and which is one of the other important elements that we should cover, is the cultural results of colonization, how ways of living and thinking amongst African people changed. In this sense, the first thing we should look at is that Europeans ignored African knowledge and art, right? Now, the first thing that a colonizer would do is to destroy your history, it is to destroy your knowledge, is to destroy your art so that you forget where you come from. Now, in this sense, they destroyed African knowledge and art because they thought it was not as developed as European scientific knowledge, right? It was seen as barbaric art, barbaric knowledge, and backward thinking. In this sense, Europeans therefore brought their own languages and forced people in Africa to use these languages, right? And they changed the name of places. They brought European culture and ideas to Africa. They built European-style housing, hospitals, and so forth. And then Europeans did benefit Africa in some way. Remember, when we look at a happening in history, we speak of the positive and the negative. However, in this sense, we can argue that the negative outweighed the positive. Now, one of the positives is that Europeans brought with Western education. They brought about medicine, they brought about Western technology to Africa, right? And they introduced sports such as soccer and cricket, just to name a few. Now, these are the benefits, in a sense, that Africa gained from this process of being colonized. Now, the final segment of this video covers the premise of why Europeans saw the need, saw the importance, and saw themselves as the ones that should what take over and lead Africa and enlighten African people, because they were dark people, they were part of the dark continent, and therefore they needed this enlightenment. Now, this looks at what we call white man's burden. Now, white man's burden, in brief, it speaks of you seeing yourself as the one who is the savior, as the one who are referred to as the catcher in the rye, right? And here is a short video that I have supplemented from YouTube that will help us understand further what it means when we look at the white man's burden.
Imagine you're playing a game where one team decides it's their job to help everyone else play better. They believe they know what's best for others and feel responsible for guiding them. This idea of taking on responsibility for others because you think you know better is similar to the concept of white man. Imagine you're playing a game where one team decides it's their job to help everyone else play better. They believe they know what's best for others and feel responsible for guiding them. This idea of taking on responsibility for others because you think you know better is similar to the concept of white man's burden. The white man's burden was a belief held by Europeans during the 19th and early 20th centuries. They thought it was their duty to bring civilization and progress to people in other parts of the world, often societies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This belief was tied to ideas of racial superiority, where Europeans considered themselves more advanced and capable of improving the lives of others.
This was seen as a responsibility.
For example, when European powers colonized countries in Africa and Asia, they often justified their actions by claiming they were helping to bring modernity, technology, and religion to societies they viewed as less developed. This was seen as a responsibility they had to fulfill for the benefit of those they colonized, even if those people didn't necessarily ask for or welcome their help. In literature and political speeches of the time, this idea was promoted as a noble mission. For instance, Rudyard Kipling, a famous British writer, wrote a poem titled The White Man's Burden in 1899, encouraging the United States to take up its role as an imperial power and bring its version of progress to the Philippines, which it had recently acquired as a colony. However, the concept of the white man's burden has faced criticism. Many argue that it was a justification for imperialism and exploitation, allowing Europeans to rationalize their control over territories and resources under the guise of civilizing native populations. Critics also highlight the arrogance and paternalism in the belief that one group of people knows what's best for everyone else. In summary, the white man's burden is the belief that certain groups...
Thank you. Now, in this sense, as we have seen from the video, white man's burden looks at basically the justification of colonizing, the justification of mass killing, the justification of genocide, right? Because they felt that they are the ones that hold upon their shoulders this duty of civilizing, of enlightening African people, of taking them out of the dark place that Africa is in and putting them in the light that Europe was in, right? And thank you very much for tuning in. I hope this video was very informative and you have learned a lot. If you have any questions, any comments, please just drop a comment on my comment section. And thank you very much and all the best with your studies and examinations. Thank you.